Hello family, welcome to Stories with Kelly. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you. As you do so, sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Prince Kale sat on his golden throne, his face calm but his heart troubled. He had always believed his 3 wives loved him, but a question had been growing in his mind for months. Did they love him for who he was or for his power, wealth, and status as heir to the throne? He had given them everything: gold, fine clothes, a life of comfort, but something felt wrong. Whenever he looked into their eyes, he did not see the warmth he longed for. When he spoke to them, their voices were sweet, but were their words true? These thoughts refused to leave his mind, making it difficult for him to find peace. He wanted to trust them, but trust was not something a prince could give blindly. He had seen how greed and ambition could change people. He had seen how quickly false love could turn into betrayal. If his wives did not truly love him, he needed to know. If they only loved what he could give them, then their love was not real at all. But how could he find the truth? If he asked them directly, they would only say what he wanted to hear. He needed to see their hearts when they believed he was no longer there. And so an idea began to form in his mind, one that would test their love in a way they could never expect. Late that night, when the palace was quiet, Prince Kale called for his most trusted servant. The servant, an old man who had been with him since childhood, listened carefully as the prince revealed his plan. "I must know if my wives truly love me," he said, his voice low but firm. "Tomorrow, I will fake my death. The kingdom will mourn, and my wives will believe I am gone. I will disguise myself as a servant and watch them closely. Only then will I see their true hearts." The servant's eyes widened in shock, but he understood. In the morning, the news spread across the palace. Prince Kale had died in his sleep. The kingdom fell into mourning, and the 3 wives were dressed in black, their faces hidden by veils. But behind those veils, what were they truly feeling? Did their hearts break with sorrow, or did they hide something else? As the funeral began, Prince Kale, now disguised as a lowly palace worker, stood in the shadows, watching. The test had begun. The funeral was grand, fit for a prince. The palace courtyard was filled with people dressed in mourning clothes. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense, and the sound of wailing echoed through the palace walls. The king, Kale's father, sat on his throne with sorrow written across his face. Servants moved about, carrying trays of food for the guests, though few had the appetite to eat. Kale, now disguised as a servant, stood at the edge of the gathering, his heart pounding as he watched his 3 wives. His first wife, Lila, knelt on the ground near his coffin, her body shaking with grief. She did not speak, nor did she raise her head. Tears flowed freely from her eyes, soaking her veil. She refused food and water, ignoring the whispers of the women around her who urged her to take care of herself. Kale felt a lump in his throat as he watched her. Was her sorrow real, or was it only for show? His second wife, Zara, stood nearby, dabbing at her eyes with a cloth. Her sobs were soft, controlled, as if carefully measured. She cried just enough to be seen as a grieving widow but not enough to lose herself in sorrow. Kale noticed how she kept glancing at the elders of the palace, the men who would decide what happened to his wealth. Later that day, when she thought no one was watching, she slipped away from the crowd and called her brother to a secret meeting. "The prince is gone," she whispered. "The elders will soon decide what happens to his fortune. We must act quickly." Kale clenched his fists as he listened from the shadows. His heart grew heavy, but he was not done watching yet. His third wife, Myra, was different from the others. Though she wore black and sat with the mourners, there was something strange about her. She was not as sad as Lila nor as calculating as Zara. Instead, she seemed impatient. Later that night, she sent a message to a nobleman, one of Kale's distant cousins. "We must meet," she wrote. "There is no reason to wait." Kale's hands shook as he read the message. His heart had been right to doubt. The truth was beginning to reveal itself. The palace was quieter after the funeral, but sadness did not fill every corner. Prince Kale, still disguised as a servant, moved through the halls unnoticed, listening, watching, learning. Lila remained in her chambers, refusing to speak to anyone. She spent her days sitting in silence, her eyes swollen from crying. She did not ask about wealth or the future, she only mourned Kale. His heart ached whenever he saw her, but he reminded himself that the test was not over yet. Zara, on the other hand, had changed completely. Her mourning clothes were still on, but her actions did not match them. She walked through the palace with purpose, speaking in hushed tones to the elders and noblemen. One evening, Kale followed her to a private chamber where she met her brother. The two sat close, their voices low but urgent. "The king is old," Zara whispered. "Soon he will name a new heir. If we do not act now, we will lose everything." Her brother nodded. "What do you plan to do?" he asked. Zara leaned in, her eyes gleaming. "I will convince the elders that I should manage the prince's fortune. Once that is done, we can take what we want." Kale's chest tightened. This was no sorrowful widow, this was a woman who saw his death as an opportunity. Meanwhile, Myra had her own plans. She no longer pretended to be heartbroken, instead, she prepared herself for a new life. Late one night, Kale watched as she left her chamber and made her way to the palace gates, where a nobleman awaited her. He was tall and dressed in fine robes, his face full of confidence. "It is too soon," he murmured as she approached. "People will talk." Myra laughed softly, placing a hand on his arm. "People talk about everything," she said. "Why should we wait? Kale is gone. There is no reason for me to be alone." The nobleman hesitated, but Myra's eyes sparkled with ambition. "If we marry," she continued, "I will still have a place in the palace. Together, we can claim what is rightfully ours." Kale felt his stomach turn. Just days after his supposed death, one wife was plotting to steal his fortune, and another was eager to replace him. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain hidden. The test was not over yet. He needed to see how far they would go, and most importantly, he needed to see if Lila's grief was real. Days passed, and the palace slowly returned to normal, but Prince Kale saw everything differently now. He had uncovered the truth about Zara and Myra, but he was not yet finished. He needed to see what they would do next. He continued his disguise, blending in with the other servants, listening in secret. One afternoon, he followed Zara again. She had requested a meeting with the elders of the palace, and she arrived dressed in black, her face calm and serious. "Honorable elders," she began, bowing slightly, "I know that the passing of my beloved husband has left the kingdom in sorrow, but while we mourn, we must also think of the future. My husband's wealth must be managed wisely, and as his wife, I am prepared to take on that responsibility." Some elders nodded thoughtfully, but others frowned. "It is not our place to decide," one of them said. "The king will choose what happens to the prince's fortune." Zara smiled, though her eyes were cold. "Of course," she said smoothly, "but as you know, the king is growing weaker. We must think ahead." Kale gritted his teeth. She was already trying to take his wealth, but he needed to see how far she would go. That night, Myra continued her secret meetings. Kale followed her again, hiding in the shadows. She met the nobleman at the far end of the palace garden, away from watching eyes. "I have waited long enough," she said in a hushed but urgent tone. "The elders are slow, and the king is old. If we delay, someone else will take control." The nobleman frowned. "And what do you suggest?" he asked. Myra lifted her chin. "We must marry immediately," she said. "Once I am your wife, my place in the palace will be secure. Together, we can claim the fortune." The nobleman hesitated. "So soon?" he asked. Myra stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. "What are you afraid of?" she whispered. "The dead do not return." Kale felt a sharp pain in his chest. She spoke of him as if he had never mattered, as if he were only a stepping stone to something greater. He turned away, anger burning inside him, but when he passed Lila in his chamber, he stopped. She was kneeling beside his old cloak, pressing it to her face, silent tears running down her cheeks. Unlike the others, she had not moved on. She had not plotted or schemed, she had only mourned. Kale took a deep breath. The test was almost over. Soon, the truth would be revealed. Prince Kale had seen enough to know the truth about his wives, Zara was plotting to take his wealth, and Myra was eager to marry another noble. Only Lila truly mourned him, but he was not done yet. He wanted to see just how far Zara and Myra would go if they thought he was truly gone. Would they betray him even more? Would they stop at greed, or would they do something even worse? He had to push them further. The next morning, still in his servant disguise, he approached Zara's chambers. She was sitting at a table covered with fine jewelry, admiring her gold rings. "My lady," he said, bowing low, "I bring news from the elders." Zara looked up sharply. "What is it?" she asked. Kale kept his voice low. "The elders are considering giving the prince's wealth to the king's advisors instead of you." Zara's eyes darkened. "They would not dare," she hissed. Kale bowed again. "It is only a rumor," he said, "but if you wish to keep the fortune, perhaps you must act quickly." Zara was silent for a long moment, then she stood and smoothed her robes. "Call my brother," she said. "We must remind the elders who truly deserves that wealth." Kale felt a pang of anger, but he kept his face calm. She had failed the test again. That evening, Kale turned his attention to Myra. He sent her a secret message, pretending to be a palace messenger. The note read, "The elders are growing suspicious. If you wish to secure your future, you must marry the nobleman within 3 days." He watched from a distance as she read it, her face breaking into a sly smile. 3 days is too long, she murmured to herself. That night, she left the palace again, meeting the nobleman in the garden. "We must marry at once," she insisted. "Before the king makes any decisions." The nobleman hesitated. "The people might talk," he said. Myra laughed softly. "Let them talk," she said. "What matters is power." Kale clenched his fists. She had not only moved on, but she was rushing to erase his memory. He had seen enough. The next day, he watched Lila again. She still refused food, still stayed in her chamber, still wept for him. She alone had remained loyal. Kale knew what he had to do. It was time to reveal the truth. The palace was buzzing with quiet whispers. The elders were preparing to meet with the king to decide what would happen to Prince Kale, his wealth, and who would manage his affairs. Meanwhile, Zara was already celebrating in secret, confident that she would gain control. Myra, on the other hand, had arranged for a secret wedding with the nobleman, eager to secure her new position before the elders could decide anything. But as they plotted, the kingdom had no idea that the prince was still alive, watching everything unfold. Kale had seen all he needed to see. Now it was time to return and reveal the truth. He called his most trusted servant and whispered his orders. "Gather the elders and the royal guards," he said. "Prepare a royal meeting in the great hall. The time has come." The servant's eyes widened, but he nodded quickly and hurried off to do as he was told. Meanwhile, Kale changed from his servant disguise back into the royal robes he had worn before his death. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and relief. He had tested their love, and now the truth would be known. That evening, the great hall was filled with important figures from across the kingdom. The elders sat in their usual places, the king sat on his throne, and the 3 wives stood to the side, waiting. Zara held her head high, expecting to be named the manager of the prince's wealth. Myra was nervous but hopeful, knowing she was about to secure her new future. Lila stood quietly, her eyes still full of sorrow. The king raised his hand to speak, but before he could, the great doors of the hall swung open. A gasp filled the room as Prince Kale stepped inside, alive and well. Myra's face turned pale, Zara's eyes widened in shock, and the elders stared in disbelief. The king himself rose from his throne, his face frozen in surprise. "My son," he whispered. Kale took a step forward, his voice strong and clear. "I have returned," he said, "and I have seen the truth." He turned toward his wives, his eyes full of disappointment. "I faked my death to see who truly loved me," he continued, "and what I discovered has broken my heart." The room was silent. The test was over, the truth was out. Now it was time for justice. Silence filled the great hall. The people stared in shock, unable to believe what they were seeing. Prince Kale stood tall, alive and well, his royal robes flowing behind him. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with disappointment and anger. The king slowly sat back down, gripping the arms of his throne. "You were dead," he murmured. "How is this possible?" Kale bowed his head respectfully. "Forgive me, father," he said, "but I had to know the truth. I faked my death and disguised myself as a servant to watch and listen." He turned to his 3 wives, his gaze heavy. "And what I saw has brought me pain." Zara and Myra stood frozen, their faces pale. Lila, who had spent days weeping for her husband, covered her mouth in shock. The elders and royal guards looked at one another, unsure of what to say. Then Kale stepped forward. "I saw how my death was met with different hearts," he continued. "One wife mourned me deeply, refusing to eat or speak. One wife saw my death as an opportunity to steal my wealth, and one wife wasted no time looking for another man to take my place." Murmurs spread through the hall as people turned to look at Zara and Myra. Zara's hands trembled, but she quickly mastered her fear with a forced smile. "My prince," she said sweetly, "it's all a misunderstanding. We were only trying to protect your wealth, to keep it safe." Kale narrowed his eyes. "By plotting with your brother behind closed doors?" Zara's face lost its color, the people in the room gasped. Kale turned to Myra, who stepped back, shaking her head. I was lonely," she stammered. "I thought you were truly gone. Can you blame me for wanting to find love again?" Kale's voice was firm. "You didn't wait even a few weeks. You didn't grieve. You were ready to erase my name and move on." Myra had no words. She looked around, hoping for support, but no one spoke for her. Kale took a deep breath, then turned to Lila. "And you," he said gently, "you alone remained loyal. You shed real tears. You did not think of gold or marriage, you only thought of your husband." Lila lowered her gaze, tears filling her eyes. Kale looked back at the king. "Now justice must be served," he said. The test was over, it was time for punishment and reward. The great hall was tense, filled with heavy silence as everyone waited for Prince Kale to speak. Zara and Myra stood frozen, their faces pale with fear. The elders whispered among themselves, and the king watched his son closely. Kale turned to the royal guards. "Take Zara and Myra away," he commanded. "They are no longer my wives, nor do they deserve a place in this palace." Zara gasped. "No, my prince, please." "It was a mistake," she cried, dropping to her knees. "I only wanted to protect what was ours." But Kale shook his head. "You wanted to steal," he said firmly. "You saw my death as an opportunity to gain power." Zara looked around desperately, but no one came to her defense. The guards stepped forward, grabbing her arms. She screamed in protest, but it was no use. Then Kale turned to Myra, who stood trembling. "You did not shed a single tear for me," he said. "Instead, you ran into another man's arms, eager to replace me." Myra's lips quivered, but she had no excuse. The nobleman who had promised to marry her stood silently, unwilling to defend her now that the truth was known. The guards took her away as well, and the great doors of the hall slammed shut behind them. Their greed had led to their downfall. Kale took a deep breath and turned to Lila. She stood quietly, her eyes still filled with sorrow and disbelief. He stepped closer. "You alone were loyal," he said softly. "You loved me, not for my wealth, but for who I am." Lila shook her head. "I did not love you for a reward, my prince," she whispered. "I loved you because my heart belonged to you." Kale felt his chest tighten. He had tested her love, and she had passed, but had he broken her trust in the process? He gently took her hand. "I know I have hurt you by faking my death," he said, "but I had to see the truth. And now I wish to honor you as my one true wife." The elders nodded in approval, and the king smiled with pride. The people in the hall clapped and cheered, happy that justice had been served. But as Kale looked into Lila's eyes, he saw hesitation. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. Lila was silent for a moment, then finally gave a small nod. "Yes," she said, "but my heart still carries pain." Kale understood, love was not only about loyalty, it was also about trust. And though Lila had remained faithful, he would have to prove himself to her once more. Days passed, and the palace returned to its usual order, But Prince Kale knew that something had changed. The betrayal of Zara and Myra had left a scar on his heart, but what hurt him more was the sadness he saw in Lila's eyes. She had remained loyal, she had mourned him with all her heart, and yet she was still distant. She no longer smiled as she once did, nor did she look at him with the same warmth. Though she had agreed to stay by his side, he could feel the weight of his deception between them. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the palace gardens, he reached for her hand. "Lila," he said gently, "I know I have hurt you. I see it in your eyes, and it pains me." Lila looked down, her fingers trembling slightly. "You tested my love," she whispered. "You made me believe I had lost you forever. Do you know how that felt?" Kale swallowed hard. "I do," he admitted, "and I regret the pain I caused you." He paused before adding, "But I had to know the truth." Lila sighed. "And now that you do, what will you do with it?" Kale thought for a long moment. "I will spend the rest of my days proving my love to you," he said at last, "not through wealth, not through power, but through my actions. I will be the husband you deserve." Lila finally looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "Love is not a game, Kale," she said softly. "It is not something to be tested like gold in fire. If you truly love someone, you trust them." Kale felt the truth of her words settle in his heart. He had tested her love, but in doing so, he had also broken her trust. Now he had to rebuild it. That night, he made a promise to himself: he would never again let doubt cloud his heart. He would cherish Lila, not just because she was the only one who had remained loyal, but because she had taught him what love truly meant. As the stars shone above them, he knew that time would heal their wounds, but he would have to be patient. Love, after all, was not about proving who is right, it was about choosing each other again and again. As time passed, the kingdom slowly forgot the scandal of Zara and Myra. They were sent away from the palace, never to return, and their greed became a lesson told in whispers across the land. But within the palace, Prince Kale worked hard to mend what had been broken. He no longer sought to test love, he sought to nurture it. Lila, though still hurt, saw the change in him. He was no longer the same man who doubted her heart. He showed his love, not with gifts, but with kindness, patience, and respect. He listened when she spoke, he stood by her side in all things, and slowly, her heart began to heal. One evening, as they walked through the palace gardens, Lila finally smiled. "You have changed, Kale," she said softly. He looked at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "Because I learned," he admitted. "I thought love was something to test, but now I know it is something to cherish." Lila took his hand for the first time in a long while, and in that simple gesture, he knew she had forgiven him. The years that followed were filled with peace and understanding. Kale and Lila ruled the kingdom together, not just as husband and wife, but as true partners. Their love was not built on wealth, nor was it something that needed to be proven. It was built on trust, respect, and unwavering devotion. The people of the land spoke of their wisdom and fairness, and their story became a lesson for generations to come. Love is not a test. True love is proven, not by tricks, but by time, by loyalty, and by the way two hearts choose each other, even in the darkest of times. And so, Prince Kale, who once doubted love, became a king who understood its true meaning, and Lila, the woman who had stayed faithful, became the queen who taught him that love is not just about loyalty, it's also about trust. Thanks for watching to the end. Please, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my page. Thank you. Oh,